The sight of Nia Carter collapsing on his Italian marble floor should have been an inconvenience Park Min-jae simply ignored. Just another broken part of the invisible woman who had scrubbed his floors twice a week for 6 months. But as she lay there, clutching a half-empty bottle of cleaning solution like a lifeline, the sheer fragility of her frame triggered a protective instinct that bypassed his cold logic. He had ended dynasties for less than the look of pure, bone-deep exhaustion on her face. "Wake up," he commanded. His voice a low, lethal vibration that usually preceded a death sentence. Nia's eyes snapped open, wide, alert, and drowning in a fear that didn't belong in his home. When she tried to scramble up, her hand brushed a crumpled eviction notice and a weathered photograph of 3 identical, dark-skinned toddlers that had fallen from her apron. I'm sorry, Mr. Park. I just got dizzy. It won't happen again." Min-jae's gaze locked onto the photo of the 3 boys, then back to the sweat glistening on Nia's forehead. For the first time in a decade of ruling the city's shadows, he felt a crack in his armor. "Who are they?" he whispered, and as Nia instinctively moved to hide the photo, the power dynamic in the room shifted forever. "Don't hide them from me," he warned, and the silence between them became heavy with the weight of a secret uncovered. Nia had cleaned Min-jae's high-rise sanctuary for 6 months without ever truly meeting his eyes. He was a ghost of luxury, the rustle of a perfectly tailored black suit, the click of expensive leather on stone, and a scent of bergamot that felt like a warning. She knew the rules. The pay was triple the city average, the penthouse was always sterile, and she was expected to be a shadow. Invisibility was Nia's survival. 29 years of living on the margins had taught her how to hold her breath in luxury elevators, and how to move through gold-plated rooms without leaving a single fingerprint on the air. Today, her invisibility was a luxury she could no longer afford. She had skipped 3 days of meals so Zion, Zara, and Zayn could have extra milk, and her body had finally revolted. In the cramped, sweltering apartment she called home, the triplets were waiting, barefoot and innocent, unaware that their mother was one dizzy spell away from losing everything. The rent was 7 days overdue, and the slumlord was no longer taking excuses. Nia didn't need a savior, she needed her paycheck. But as she looked up into the intense, calculating eyes of the city's most dangerous man, Nia realized that her secret wasn't just out, it was now his. Min-jae didn't move. He stood like a monolith of dark wool and cold intent, his eyes anchored to the crumpled photograph of the 3 small boys. The silence in the penthouse, usually a peaceful shield against the chaos of Los Angeles, now felt like a vacuum, sucking the oxygen out of Nia's lungs. "Their names," Min-jae said. It wasn't a request. Nia finally managed to find her feet, her legs trembling beneath her faded beige apron. She reached out, her fingers twitching, desperate to reclaim the only piece of her heart she allowed into this sterile, dangerous place. "They don't matter to you, Mr. Park. I'm sorry I brought personal items into your home. It's against the agency's policy." "I'll go." "I am the policy," Min-jae countered, his voice dropping an octave. He held the photo just out of her reach, his gaze finally lifting to hers. The ice in his expression hadn't melted, but there was a new, searing heat behind it. "You haven't eaten in days. Your pulse is erratic. And you are hiding 3 children in a city that swallows people like you whole. Their names, Nia." She swallowed hard, her guarded posture crumbling under the weight of his scrutiny. "Zion, Zara, and Zayn," she whispered, the names feeling like a confession. "They're 3. They're triplets." Min-jae's eyes flickered back to the photo. 3 identical faces, dark-skinned and serious, looking back at him with the same wary determination he saw in their mother. He thought of the 6 months she had spent moving through his home like a ghost, scrubbing his sins off the floor while her own stomach remained empty to ensure theirs were full. The realization felt like a physical blow to his ribs. "And the father?" Min-jae asked, his jaw tightening. "Is he the reason you hide in the shadows?" Nia let out a hollow, jagged laugh that sounded more like a sob. "The father is a memory I've worked very hard to bury. There is no one, Mr. Park. Just me." And if the agency finds out I'm distracted by them, or if social services thinks I can't provide. She stopped, her voice breaking as she looked at the minimalist multi-million-dollar decor surrounding them. Please, give me the photo. I need to get home. Min-jae didn't hand it back. Instead, he tucked the photograph into the breast pocket of his suit, right over his heart. The gesture was terrifyingly possessive. You aren't going back to that apartment to starve in the dark, Nia. You don't understand, she pleaded, stepping toward him. Her fear of him momentarily eclipsed by her need to protect her secret. You're a man of your world. My world is small. It's fragile. If you touch it, you'll break it. Then I will build a cage around it, Min-jae replied. His eyes dark and calculating. One that no one else can penetrate. The transition was swift and absolute, as if Min-jae had simply decided the sun should rise in the west and the world had no choice but to comply. Within 24 hours, the minimalist silence of the penthouse was shattered. Nia felt like she was moving through a fever dream as she stepped off the private elevator, clutching Zion and Zayn's small hands while Zara balanced on her hip. The triplets were unervingly quiet, their wide, dark eyes taking in the floor-to-ceiling glass and the cold, polished surfaces that cost more than their entire neighborhood. They looked like small, beautiful intruders in a kingdom of glass. This is too much, Mr. Park, Nia whispered, her voice trembling as she looked at the transformation. One corner of the expansive living area, previously occupied by a hand-carved obsidian sculpture, had been cleared. In its place stood plush rugs, high-end wooden blocks, and 3 soft velvet chairs sized for toddlers. It wasn't just a gesture. It was a takeover. Min-jae appeared from the hallway, having shed his suit jacket. His white dress shirt was unbuttoned at the collar, sleeves rolled up to reveal forearms corded with muscle and the faint edge of a dark tattoo. He looked less like a businessman and more like the predator he truly was, yet he moved toward them with a measured, careful grace. The slumlord sent 2 men to your door an hour after you left yesterday, Min-jae said. His voice a low rumble that made the hair on Nia's neck stand up. They didn't find you. They won't find you here. You went to my home. Nia's grip tightened on her son's. You shouldn't have done that. You're drawing a map right to us. I am erasing the map, Nia. He knelt, bringing himself level with the triplets. Zion, the boldest of the 3, took a tentative step forward, his tiny hand reaching out to touch the heavy platinum watch on Min-jae's wrist. Nia gasped, ready to pull him back, but Min-jae didn't flinch. He stayed perfectly still, allowing the child to inspect him like a curious cub. The contrast was jarring. The man who controlled the city's shadows, whose hands were stained with the machinery of violence, now serving as a focal point for an innocent child's wonder. Nia watched as Min-jae's intense, calculating gaze softened, just for a fraction of a second, as he looked at Zion. They are thin, Min-jae noted, his eyes flicking up to Nia, the coldness returning. My chef has prepared a meal. You will eat with me. No cleaning today. No invisibility. I don't know how to be here like this, Nia admitted, her exhaustion warring with her pride. Learn, he commanded softly, standing up and towering over them once more. Because the world that made you stay hungry is over. You are under my roof now. As the triplets began to cautiously explore their new playroom, the cool blue light of the penthouse met the warm, frantic beating of Nia's heart. The collision had begun, and there was no going back to the shadows. The following afternoon, Min-jae sat in the back of a blacked-out sedan, the leather cool against his skin as the vehicle crawled through the broken streets of Nia's neighborhood. In his hand was a folder containing the history of one Silas Vane, a man who built his small, pathetic fortune on the desperation of mothers. He's in the back office of the laundromat, his driver Dae-ho reported. He has 2 security guys with him, low-level thugs. Min-jae didn't respond. He stepped out of the car, his polished shoes a stark contrast to the cracked pavement and the smell of stagnant rain and exhaust. He looked out of place, a wolf in a sheep's pen, but he didn't care about the optics. He only thought of Nia's face when she talked about the map being drawn to her door, the bone-deep terror of a woman who had been hunted by poverty her entire life. The door to the office didn't just open. It yielded. Silas Vane, a bloated man with tobacco-stained fingers and an aura of unearned confidence, looked up from a stack of grimy bills. "We're closed, pal. Get out." Min-jae walked to the desk, his movements slow and predatory. The two thugs stepped forward, but one look at the cold, dead stillness in Min-jae's eyes made them hesitate. They recognized the scent of real violence, the kind that didn't need to shout to be felt. "Nia Carter," Min-jae said, the name sounding like a prayer and a threat all at once. Silas sneered, leaning back. "Oh, the maid. She owes you money too. Get in line. She's behind on rent, and those 3 brats of hers are a liability. I'm clearing them out by Monday." Min-jae leaned over the desk, his shadow swallowing the man whole. He didn't reach for a weapon. He didn't need to. He simply placed a heavy, gold-embossed envelope on the desk. "Inside is a deed for a property 10 miles from here. It is far better than this cage you provide. You will sign this building over to my holding company for the price of $1. And then you will disappear." Silas let out a jagged laugh. "You're crazy. I don't sell to." Min-jae's hand moved faster than the eye could follow, his fingers locking around Silas's throat, slamming his head back against the chair. The thugs moved, but Dae-ho was already there, the silent click of a safety being disengaged echoing in the small room like a thunderclap. "I am not a businessman today," Min-jae whispered into Silas's ear, his voice deadly calm. "I am the man who will burn everything you love while you watch, simply because you made her flinch. You have 10 seconds to decide if you want to keep breathing or keep this slum." The language of protection was not one of negotiation. It was one of absolute surrender. 5 minutes later, Min-jae walked back to the car, the signed papers in hand. He had spoken the only language Silas understood. And now, Nia was no longer a tenant. She was free. The scent of bulgogi and toasted sesame oil filled the penthouse, a warm, savory fog that softened the sharp edges of the glass walls. Nia stood by the kitchen island, her hand still instinctively reaching for a cleaning rag before she remembered she was a guest at a table she usually polished. Min-jae had dismissed the staff, preferring the heavy, intimate silence of the high-rise over the fuss of servers. At the center of the massive mahogany table, Zion, Zara, and Zayn sat perched on their new chairs, looking like small explorers in a vast, strange land. Between them lay an array of porcelain bowls, vibrant kimchi, glazed potatoes, and steaming rice. Min-jae sat at the head, his stiff white shirt unbuttoned further than Nia had ever seen, his expression uncharacteristically patient. "Not like that, little warrior," Min-jae murmured, his voice losing its lethal edge as he looked at Zion. The boy was struggling with a pair of training chopsticks, his brow furrowed in a mimicry of Min-jae's own intensity. With a grace Nia found mesmerizing, the man who ordered executions reached out and gently adjusted Zion's tiny fingers. His large, scarred hand completely engulfed the boy's, guided by a tenderness that seemed to surprise even him. "The sticks are like an extension of your hand. Respect them, and the food will follow." Nia watched, her heart doing a slow, painful roll in her chest. She had expected a lecture on etiquette or perhaps a cold display of wealth. Instead, she saw a boyish light in Min-jae's eyes as he showed Zara how to wrap a piece of marinated beef in a lettuce leaf. When Zayn accidentally dropped a piece of potato on the expensive rug, Nia lunged forward, her old fears of making a mess screaming in her ears. "Leave it," Min-jae said, his voice firm but not unkind. He caught Nia's gaze, and for a moment the room felt smaller. "It is just a rug, Nia. It is not more important than his discovery." He turned back to the triplets, showing them how to say Kamsahamnida, his face breaking into a rare, genuine smile when they chirped the syllables back in a messy, rhythmic chorus. In that moment, the ghost of Century City vanished. In his place was a man who seemed to be realizing that his empire of stone and steel had been missing a pulse. Nia sat back, slowly picking up her own chopsticks. For the first time in 6 months, she didn't feel like a shadow. She felt the weight of Min Jae's gaze. Not as a boss and not as a threat, but as a man looking at a woman he finally, truly intended to keep. The food was warm, the laughter of her children was loud, and the danger of the world outside felt miles away. The peace of the penthouse didn't shatter with a bang. It died with a sharp, rhythmic rapping on the heavy oak double doors. Nia's instinct, honed by years of precarious survival, went cold before the door even opened. When Min Jae's head of security stepped aside to reveal a woman in a sharp gray blazer holding a clipboard, Nia felt the floor liquefy beneath her. "Nia Carter?" the woman asked, her eyes already scanning the room, landing on Zion and Zane playing on the plush rug. "I'm Detective Morrison with Child Protective Services. We received an anonymous tip regarding the safety of your children and their proximity to high-risk criminal activity." Nia's breath hitched. The triplets froze, sensing the sudden spike in tension. Behind her, she heard the heavy, deliberate footfall of Min Jae. He didn't hide. He stepped into the light, his presence a dark, suffocating weight. "This is a private residence," he said, his voice dropping into that lethal, subsonic register. "You are trespassing." "Min Jae, stop," Nia gasped, her voice thin with terror. She turned to him, her eyes wide and wet. "This is exactly what I told you. I told you your world would break mine." The detective didn't flinch. "Ms. Carter, the report alleges that you've moved your children into the home of a known figure in the Korean underworld. If I cannot verify their safety and the legitimacy of this living arrangement, I have a court order to take them into temporary state custody immediately." The word custody hit Nia like a physical blow. She lunged toward her children, gathering all three into her arms, her body a frantic shield. She looked at Min Jae, the man who had fed them, the man who had adjusted Zion's fingers on a chopstick, and for the first time since the night she collapsed, she didn't see a protector. She saw the target he had painted on their backs. "You did this," she hissed, the words jagged with betrayal. "You thought you were saving us, but you just gave them a reason to take them away. Your protection is a noose, Min Jae." Min Jae stood perfectly still, his jaw tight, his hands clenched at his sides. For all his power, for all his billions and his soldiers, he was powerless against the ink on the detective's paper. He saw the way Nia looked at him, with the same flickering fear she had once reserved for her slumlord, and it burned him deeper than any bullet ever could. "I will handle this," he whispered, stepping toward her. "Don't!" Nia screamed, recoiling as if his touch were poison. "Every time you handle something, the blood gets closer to my children. Please just let us go. If they see us with you, they'll never let me keep them." As the detective stepped forward to begin her interview, Min Jae realized the devastating truth. His shadow was no longer a sanctuary. It was a cage that was finally closing in. The silence that followed Nia's departure didn't just fill the penthouse. It haunted it. Min Jae stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, the glowing Los Angeles skyline looking like a field of cold, distant diamonds. For the first time in his life, the vastness of his empire felt like a tomb. He had spent years building walls to keep the world out, never realizing those same walls would eventually lock out the only light he had ever truly wanted to keep. Nia had vanished into the gray, sprawling safety of a women's shelter on the edge of the city. It was a place of linoleum floors, the scent of industrial bleach, and the low, constant hum of other people's tragedies. She sat on a narrow cot, Zion, Zara, and Zane tangled together in a restless sleep beside her. The triplets were confused, their small faces etched with a quiet, subdued sadness that broke Nia's heart more than the hunger ever had. They missed the soft rugs. They missed the tall man who taught them how to hold chopsticks. "It's for the best," Nia whispered into the dark, though the words felt like ash in her mouth. She had traded the dangerous luxury of Min Jae's world for the sterile safety of a bunk bed. Here, the law couldn't claim she was living with a criminal, but she felt more invisible than ever. She was back to being a number, a case file, a woman folding herself smaller to avoid disturbing the air. Back in Century City, Min-jae stared at the small wooden blocks left scattered in the corner of the living room. He didn't order the staff to clean them. He didn't touch them. He simply watched them, a grim reminder of the collision that had nearly destroyed the woman he loved. Every hour of silence was a physical weight. He had the power to find her in minutes. His reach extended into every corner of this city, but he stayed his hand. He knew that to hunt her now would only prove her right. His protection was a noose, and if he pulled the string, he would lose her forever. 4 days of hollow silence stretched into an eternity. Min-jae stopped eating. The bulgogi tasted like dust. Nia stopped dreaming. Her mind was a frantic loop of legal forms and survival tactics. They were separated by miles of concrete and centuries of circumstance, both realizing that the great divide between their worlds wasn't a matter of money or blood. It was a matter of trust. And in the quiet of the night, under the same cold moon, they both wondered if they were brave enough to cross it. The fluorescent lights of the shelter hummed with a headache-inducing buzz, casting a sickly pallor over the rows of metal cots. Nia sat upright, her back against the cold brick wall, watching the rhythmic rise and fall of her children's chests. In this place, every shadow looked like a threat, and every footstep in the hallway made her heart hammer against her ribs. But the footsteps that approached at 2 a.m. were different. They weren't the heavy, tired trudge of a security guard or the frantic pace of a desperate resident. They were measured, quiet, and possessed a gravity that Nia recognized in her very marrow. When the door to the communal area creaked open, she didn't scream. She simply watched as Park Min-jae stepped into the dim light. He looked nothing like the king of Century City. His hair was uncharacteristically tousled. His jaw was shadowed with stubble, and the charcoal suit jacket he wore looked heavy, as if it were weighed down by the secrets of the city. He didn't have his guards. He didn't have his hollow authority. He looked for the first time, like a man who had walked through a fire and realized he'd left the only thing that mattered behind. "How did you find me?" Nia whispered, her voice cracking as she stood to meet him, keeping herself between him and the sleeping triplets. "I didn't use my men if that's what you're afraid of," Min-jae said, his voice a raw, jagged thread of its former self. He stopped several feet away, honoring the distance she had placed between them. "I remembered you mentioned the name of the parish your grandmother used to visit. I looked for the light that didn't belong in the dark. You shouldn't be here, Min-jae. The detective has been handled legally. My lawyers have filed the paperwork proving my home is a safe environment, and I have begun the process of transferring my holdings into blind trusts." He took a single step forward, his eyes burning with an intensity that made Nia's breath hitch. "But that isn't why I'm here. I'm here because the penthouse is a tomb without the sound of their feet on the floor. I'm here because I finally realized that my empire is just a collection of expensive stones if you aren't in it." Nia shook her head, tears finally spilling over. "It's too dangerous. Your world is blood and business." "Then I will leave that world," he promised, his voice trembling with a vulnerability Nia never thought possible for a man like him. "I am dismantling it, Nia. The restaurants, the real estate, it will all be legitimate. No more shadows. No more ghosts. I will give it all up to be the man who stands at your door and is allowed to stay. I don't want to be a boss. I want to be home." In the silence of the shelter, the great divide narrowed. Min-jae reached out, his hand open and trembling, not demanding her surrender, but begging for her trust. Nia looked at his hand, then at her sleeping sons, and realized that the man standing before her wasn't a predator anymore. He was a man who had finally found something worth more than power. The weeks that followed were a surgical dismantling of a life built on violence. Min-jae moved through his organization not with the fire of a conqueror, but with the cold, precise focus of a man cutting out a poison. To the underworld of Los Angeles, it looked like the Great Retreat. To Min-jae, it was a baptism. He sat in smoke-filled boardrooms and dimly lit backrooms, signing away territories, shuttering high-stakes gambling dens, and severing ties with men who only knew how to speak in blood. You're giving up the crown for a maid and 3 bastards. One of his lieutenants had sneered during a final tense meeting in Koreatown. Min-jae hadn't raised his voice. He hadn't even stood up. He simply looked at the man with a clarity so piercing the room went silent. I am giving up a graveyard, Min-jae replied, his voice like grinding stones. For the first time in my life, I am choosing something that breathes. As the Park empire was liquidated into legitimate real estate holdings, tech investments, and a series of high-end culinary ventures, Nia watched the transformation from the safety of a new home, a sun-drenched house in the hills, far from the sterile glass of the penthouse and the gray despair of the shelter. There were no hidden cameras here, no guards in the hallways. Only the sound of wind in the eucalyptus trees and the chaotic, joyous shrieks of Zion, Zara, and Zayn as they ran through a yard that actually belonged to them. Min-jae would return home late, the scent of bergamot now mixed with the mundane smell of old paper and ink. He looked tired, the shadows beneath his eyes deeper than ever, but the lethal tension that had once defined his posture was gone. He was no longer a man waiting for an assassin. He was a man building a fortress out of honesty. Nia met him at the door one evening, not with a cleaning rag or a look of terror, but with a quiet glass of water and a hand that reached out to touch his cheek. Is it done? She asked softly. The last of the old contracts was burned today, he said, leaning into her touch, his eyes closing in a moment of pure, unadulterated relief. The lawyers have finalized the trust for the boys. They are safe, Nia. The system has nothing left to find. Nia leaned her forehead against his, the fear that had been her constant companion for years finally beginning to dissipate like morning mist. He had promised to build a cage around her world to protect it, but instead, he had torn down his own walls to join her in the light. The transition wasn't just about money or titles. It was the slow, painful process of a ghost becoming a man. And as she looked into his eyes, she realized that for the first time, they weren't just surviving. They were starting. 5 years later, the floor-to-ceiling glass of the Century City penthouse no longer reflected a cold, solitary kingdom. Instead, the polished surfaces were mapped with the joyful evidence of a life fully lived. Sticky handprints on the lower panes, a stray wooden dinosaur tucked behind a velvet sofa, and the vibrant, messy colors of a home that had finally learned how to breathe. Nia stood in the center of the kitchen, no longer wearing a faded apron, but a sharp, tailored blazer of her own. Her business, Carter & Company. Management had grown from a desperate dream into one of the city's most respected boutique firms, providing fair wages and dignity to hundreds of women who had once been as invisible as she was. She checked her watch, a quiet smile playing on her lips, as the private elevator chimed. The silence was instantly obliterated by a stampede of rhythmic thundering. Zion, Zara, and Zayn, now tall and energetic 7-year-olds, abandoned their homework at the dining table and raced toward the doors. Dad! The chorus rang out, a sound that still made Nia's heart catch in her throat every time she heard it. Min-jae entered, catching Zayn midair as the boy launched himself at him. He looked younger than he had 5 years ago. The lethal hardness in his eyes had been replaced by a deep, grounded peace. He was no longer the ghost of Century City, but a man who spent his afternoons in boardrooms and his evenings at soccer practices. He dropped a kiss on each of the boys' heads, his movements full of a practiced, easy affection that Nia once thought impossible for a man of his history. How was the meeting? Nia asked, stepping into his space. Min-jae set Zayn down and wrapped an arm around Nia's waist, drawing her close. The scent of bergamot was still there, but the scent of danger had long since evaporated, replaced by the familiar warmth of home. The Foundation's new community center in Koreatown is officially approved, he murmured, his voice a low, contented rumble. No more shadows, Nia. Just as I promised. He looked around the room, at the triplets arguing over a board game, at the sunlight hitting the photos of their wedding on the mantel, and finally back to Nia. For 6 months, she had been a ghost in his halls, a woman he had seen without truly seeing. Now, she was the sun around which his entire world orbited. You're staring, Nia teased, leaning her head against his shoulder. I'm just making sure you're real, he whispered, his grip tightening just a fraction. Every day, I wake up and I'm still surprised that the most dangerous man in Los Angeles got to keep the only thing that ever mattered. Nia smiled, looking out at the city skyline that once seemed so cold and unreachable. In the penthouse where she had once scrubbed floors in secret, she was finally seen, finally safe, and finally home. And as the triplets' laughter echoed against the glass, she knew that the collision of their worlds hadn't broken them. It had made them whole.